Hello, Void Dwellers. I find it fascinating and a little bit depressing that communism is still a controversial subject in 2024. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a communist, I'm a social democrat, which is a branch of capitalism. I don't mean that I think communism should be an acceptable philosophy. I mean that I think we should be past already the point of knowing that it's not. Also, I find the emotional baggage that people still carry towards it, whether they are for it or against it, a bit ridiculous. I remember as a child watching all those movies and shows about the US in the 1950s, the McCarthy hearings, and wondering why did they treat what I thought was simply a social economical philosophy with such hate. Well, nowadays as a grown-up I do understand why, but I don't necessarily agree with it, but I do understand it. See, the communists still treat it as this perfect system that would totally save humanity and make a paradise on earth, ignoring of course the hundreds of millions who died for this perfect system in wars, persecutions and atrocities. And the capitalists still treat it as the source of all evil, because God forbid the workers have human rights and pay and resources are divided in a fair way, ignoring the hundreds of millions who died under the capitalist boot of war, slavery and abuse. But personally, as a Jew, and as a Jew from a family with a little communist history in it, I also have another layer of love-hate relationship with the philosophy of communism and with communists. Because in case you don't know, communism has been traditionally very, very anti-Semitic and remains so to this day. And yet, it was a Jew that invented the entire philosophy. So for me, it was always like Christianity all over again. A movement that starts by a Jew, takes over half of the world, and ends up being the reason for the deaths and persecution of millions of Jews worldwide. Which I mean, we really should start keeping our ideas to ourselves. But then of course they'll say we're conspirators, so fucking hell, we can't win. Anyway, the story of communism and my family starts with the birth of my grandfather, who was born in 1912 in Berlin. The family was working class family, merchants, and not very successful ones. In his youth, my grandfather wanted to drop out of school and get a job to help the family. His dad wouldn't hear of it. A Jew out of school? The shame! What would the Gentiles think? My family was part of the Jewish movement of the Haskalah, which at that period were Jews who believed they should prove their worth to the Gentiles and assimilate. Jewish families push their children to excel in everything and to be model citizens. Every Jew was told they represent the entire nation and so must be the best version of themselves. This attitude started in the 19th century with the Jewish emancipation in Europe. Another movement that started in the 19th century was Zionism. The Zionists believed that Gentiles would never accept us Jews as equals, no matter what we do, and that the only rational and just thing to do is for the Jews to gain self-determination and go back to their historical homeland. But at the time, it was the Haskalah movement that was the more popular amongst European Jews. And two things helped to change that: Hitler and communism. When my grandfather was a teenager in the late 20s, he became interested in communism. Something that the young generation has to understand, and I didn't realize it too when I was young, is that in those days, the communists were like the punk rockers or the hippies of the time. They were the rebels. They were the ones who believed they found a better way and they would make the world better and fairer for everyone. And the Russian Revolution was an inspiration to them. They didn't see the totalitarianism or fascism that went along with it. I mean, the point of communism is that it should be the rule of the people, the ultimate democracy. But that has never happened in any of the countries that ever claimed to be communists. In the end, it was always the opposite of true communism. It was always a ruling party, once again living above everyone else in conditions that the plebs could not even dream of. The human race is a dumb creature, and they keep replacing dictators by other dictators and calling it revolution. It's only a revolution for the elite who win through the blood of the plebs. In the end, they didn't change the game, they just changed the names and definitions. But back then, the youth were naive and stupid and didn't know all of that. They are like that today as well, but worse, because these days, those who support communism actually do know that. But that's another issue. Anyway, my grandfather was very much pro-communism, and when things got a bit hot in Berlin, especially following the Nazi takeover in 1933, he fled to Paris, where he joined, of course, the Communist Party. He even spent a few months in prison for them. And then he came out of prison and went straight to a rally. And the leader of the branch was speaking. And everybody was applauding. My grandfather was applauding too. And then, not 10 minutes into his speech, the tone changed. It wasn't the rich who were the problem anymore. It wasn't the man. It wasn't the capitalists. It was the Jew. The Jew was the evil that must be vanquished. And my grandfather looked around him at all those smiling faces, those people who clapped enthusiastically, the people he just spent a few months in prison for, his so-called comrades. And right then and there, he converted to Zionism. Right there and there, he realized the Zionists were right. The Gentiles would never let us be. We must have self-determination in order to survive. And at that moment, he made the decision to leave Europe and join the Zionists in the British Mandate of Palestine, or the land of Israel as we call it. A decision that without it, I wouldn't be here today. Anyone of my family who didn't get out of Europe died in the death camps. He managed to get his sister and parents out, but uncles, cousins, nephews, nieces, schoolmates, teenage girlfriends, all burned in the flames of the Holocaust. My grandfather used to say about Holocaust deniers, "Great! It didn't happen? Amazing! Wonderful! Then give me back all those people." Oh, to wake up to a world where the Holocaust never happened. Make it a hoax. Please make it a hoax. And make the 7th of October a hoax too while we're at it. Just, give me back those people too. Anyway, communism, right. The anti-Semitism that my grandfather experienced in the communist movement was not a one-time fluke, nor was it something that disappeared over time. In fact, one of the current anti-Semitic tropes, "We're not anti-Semitic, we're anti-Zionists," that was invented by the USSR. That was something they would say all the way back in the 40s and all the way to the late 80s. But if you talk to Jews who lived in the USSR, they would tell you that, much like today, that was just a slogan. In reality, Jews were persecuted regardless of if they were Zionists or not. People were taunted and assaulted on the street for being Jewish every day. Jews were barred from certain universities, from certain professions. This is not in some old world kind of setting. We're talking about the 1970s, the 1980s. And hell, to this day there are institutions in Russia who would openly say, "We do not accept Jews." Lenin was an anti-Semite, as was Stalin. We're talking about the early 20th century here, way before Israel was even founded. And the excuse was that communism is supposed to be an anti-nationalist movement, a globalist movement. And Zionism, by nature, is a nationalist movement. But in truth, it was actually just anti-Semitism in Russian culture that predates the communist revolution. Some of the worst pogroms in Jewish history took place in Russia in the 19th century, the 18th, the 17th century. If you ever watch Fiddler on the Roof, well, that also happens in Russia. Well, technically in Ukraine, but at the time where it was part of Russia. And here's something most people don't know. You know that Tim Burton film, Corpse Bride? It's a story about a girl who is murdered on her wedding night, and she lies and waits until someone unwittingly puts a ring on her finger, mistaking it for a branch, rehearsing his wedding vows, and the bride comes back to life to finally be wed. Well, that story is actually stolen from Jewish folklore. And in the original story, which originated in Russia, she was murdered by a mob during a pogrom on a wedding night, much like what happens in Fiddler on the Roof, only there, for the sake of keeping the musical light, nobody is killed. So Russia always had a dark and deep history of anti-Semitism. In fact, some of the most known tropes about Jews as a dark force working against the state comes from Russia. The idea of calling Jews Nazis comes from Russia. And when Zionism appeared, for the Russians, it was like evidence that the Jews have other loyalties. When the communists took over, this attitude stayed with them, even though they were following a philosophy created by a Jew. Of course, once the 20th century progressed and Israel was established, the new reason for anti-Semitism was the political rivalry with the West. The West supported Israel, so the Russians supported the enemies of Israel, the Arab world, and made them their allies. And they have been flooding them with their anti-Semitism and fanning the flames ever since. It became a little better during Gorbachev's time, when the USSR fell. But these days, in Putin's age, we are back to full anti-Semitism, just like the good old days. And like back then, they now again spread it around the West, within the groups that are sympathetic to them. Remarkably enough, the USSR actually prevented Jews from leaving. Every Jew, in their eyes, was a potential asset of the West, a potential spy. Which means that even if you were sick of the persecution and said, fine, leave me alone, I'll just fucking go, they would say, you're not going anywhere, Jew boy. And there were many people who spent years in prison for the crime of trying to smuggle Jews out of the country, away from persecution. Now, the thing to realize about the global communist movement is that they all took their cues from Russia. They still do. It doesn't matter if you're in the UK, or in South America, or in China. It doesn't matter. All communist parties and organizations shared the same propaganda that came out of Moscow. In fact, if Moscow didn't like you, you could lose your place in your local party. And that has happened repeatedly across the world, including here in the UK when people spoke out of line. So of course they also shared in the anti-Semitic propaganda that came out of Russia. And that is what we see in the leftist Western movements to this day. Everything you hear about Zionism and Jews in those far-left pro-terror and Hamas hate marches and demonstrations, all of it is written and approved by Russia. So because of that, communism has always been and always will be a deeply anti-Semitic movement. And yet, it always had and still has a lot of support amongst many Jews, including Zionists. In the early days of Israel, much of the country was following the communist models. In fact, a lot of the Zionists consider Zionism as a form of communist revolution. After all, this was the people taking power back into their own hands, working the land, growing what they needed, controlling the means of production. There's this concept in Israel called a kibbutz, which is sort of a communist community, where everybody takes turn working in different jobs that the kibbutz needs, and everybody gets room, food, and clothes from the kibbutz. I would go as far as to claim that the Israeli kibbutz was in fact the best accurate practice of real communism in the history of the world. And the kibbutzes were very common when the country started because it was a very efficient way of maintaining a community. See, unlike what the BBC would tell you about how the rich and powerful Jews came in their spaceships, in reality, it was small, vulnerable communities who fought really hard to maintain themselves in arid and difficult areas. So a design where everybody works and food and resources are shared equally worked really well for them. And they were, many of them, not just Zionists by ideology, but communists. There were kibbutzes where a portrait of Stalin would hang on the walls of the mess hall. And even the early governments of Israel took on a communist spirit, at least in the beginning. Not completely, but in many aspects. For example, in the 1950s, The fledgling country was so poor and short on resources that the government rationed basic food items like bread, egg, and milk. Architecture in Israel followed the Soviet style. Government propaganda followed the Soviet style. Many Jews and many Israelis back then saw themselves as part of the communist bloc. Personally, I find it amazing that Israeli kibbutzes hung pictures of Stalin on the wall when we should have wanted to hang him. He was one of the worst anti-Semites in history. But then when I was young and I was involved in leftist movements in Israel, I saw many people walking around with a Che Guevara t-shirt. And he was too a terrible anti-Semite, not to mention a homophobe and a murderer. So I noticed from an early age that humans tend not to be consistent and logical, and they like to follow idols, even the idols who would see them and their family burn. And by the way, one of the most annoying things about all of this is that the narrative you find from anti-Semites on the far right is that Jews were behind the communist revolution. So the communists hate us because they claim we're nationalists, and the fascists hate us because they claim we're communists. Which just proves, yet again, that all of these political reasons are just excuses. They are just that Jews are poisoning the wells of modern times. Personally, I always viewed communism as not much more than a botched philosophy. I would read philosophers like Marcuse or Zizek, and they try to explain why Marx's natural revolution never took place. And they point out to things in capitalism that stop people from seeing the good lives they would have without consumerism. And I always think, they make really good points, I like both of them, but you guys are missing the point entirely. Have you met people? Communism is simply not compatible with the human nature. You give them this philosophy about no classes where everyone is equal, and every single time they try to follow it, they end up with a ruling class living above everyone else, totalitarianism, death, and suffering. The human creature is not fit for such an ideal. I still take ideas from it. I still believe in ideas of the left. I believe in social services. I believe in guaranteed minimum income. I believe in guaranteed housing and free education, including higher education. I believe in progressing our ideas and moving forwards. Communism, unfortunately, is not that. It's the opposite. It's an old philosophy, proven again and again to be false, to not work. But as a Jew, I have to reject it also on a self-preservation stance. I find it remarkable that 60 years later, I had the same awakening my grandfather had. Because I also was attracted to the left in my youth, to the punk rockers, to the rebels. I also wanted to change the world and make it fairer for everyone. But I ended up realizing that I'm surrounding myself by people who didn't view me as an actual human, who thought I was some part of some great conspiracy. Forget the fact that I come from a dysfunctional family and cartoonish Dixonian poverty, and I'm talking patching up your shoes with sellotape as a kid kind of poverty. To them, I am the man. I control the world. I am the enemy. And the very thought that I have a right for self-determination, like all other people around the world, is appalling to them. Me and my family can be burned and raped and mutilated, and it's always acceptable. There's always an excuse. Unlike what I thought as a youth, the people who support communism are not my people. They are not my allies. They danced in the streets while our children were burned alive. Unfortunately for Jews, communism should be viewed as nothing short of Nazism. Putin calls us Nazis. Putin is de facto a Nazi. Putin would have exterminated every Jew on the planet if he could, and therefore communism should be fought the same way. Some people may have the privilege of viewing it as a workers' movement or a political movement to rid humanity of the man. But I know better. And I'm now third generation in my family to know better. The man to them is the Jew. Communism, unfortunately, is nothing more than a hate movement. And I think it's time Jews wake up to that reality and respond to it appropriately.